Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We're here today to talk about ATF's failures in the death of ICE agent Jaime Zapata. You know, there's nothing more difficult than dealing with a person who puts their life on the line for the United States of America, and they get killed doing it. They lose their life. The Zapata family deserves some answers. Wonderful family. Jaime was one of, I think, 5 children, 5 kids. All those brothers serve in law enforcement, various capacities. And I don't know that the Zapata family is here. I hope they're able to watch on television. I think that they are. But it breaks your heart when you have somebody that young who is serving their nation and their life is taken. And it was violent, and it was, many people believe, preventable. But it's also a responsibility, I believe, of the United States to, and the Congress to understand what happened so that we can try to help prevent it and make sure that it never happens again. It's also, I think, an imperative, it certainly is in my heart, to give answers to the family so they can understand what happened and what went well and what didn't go well. And as you'll hear me say time and time again in this committee, we're different in the United States. We are self-critical. We do take a good hard look at ourselves and ask difficult questions. And it's one of the things that differentiates the United States of America from just about every other country on the planet. That you can speak truth to power, you can bring people in, you can grill them and talk to them and answer or ask hard questions and get those answers, and we are self-critical. It's not just here to protect the politically elite or the higher-ups in government. So what happened on February 15th of 2011, more than 6 years ago now, cartel members in Mexico murdered an Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent, Jaime Zapata. He was driving there on ICE business. One of the firearms recovered from the attack traced back to an October 2010 purchase by Otilio Osorio at a Dallas-Fort Worth gun show. The evidence uncovered by the Department of Justice Inspector General shows that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, failed to investigate Osorio, his brother Renferi Osorio, and their associates, who were all part of a straw purchasing ring. Straw purchasing. It's illegal in the United States of America to buy a gun for someone else, and you certainly can't do that for others in mass. It's against the law. Evidently, the ATF potentially missed chances to prevent the firearms in question from being trafficking to Mexico. The ATF knew in June of 2010 that the Osorios were associated with an organization that was likely trafficking firearms to Mexico. In fact, the Inspector General found that by late September 2010, the ATF should have been investigating the Osorio brothers and their associates. As the IG summarized, and I quote, "These were dangerous individuals involved in serious and significant ongoing criminal activities that represented a substantial risk to public safety in the United States and Mexico," end quote. The Inspector General also found a scenario where ATF had both a legal authority and the opportunity to take firearms in the Osorio's possessions, but failed to seize them. Those firearms were also later found at a crime scene. Unlike the Fast and Furious case, which this committee has been vigorously pursuing, where refraining from contacting strong purchasers was part of the flawed strategy, the Inspector General found the Dallas Field Division simply failed to do its job. We'll never know whether Agent Zapata would still be alive if the ATF had done its job properly, and we rely heavily on the Inspector General and their expertise in looking at this. And again, our hearts and minds and prayers go to the Zapata family. In September of 2012, nearly 5 years ago, the committee and Senator Chuck Grassley requested an investigation of ATF's actions relating to Agent Zapata's death. We presented evidence to the IG obtained from confidential sources as well as whistleblowers. We told the Inspector General that ATF may have had probable cause to arrest the Osorio brothers in November of 2010 when ATF witnessed them providing 40 weapons with obliterated serial numbers to an undercover ATF informant at a Walmart parking lot for the purpose of trafficking those weapons to Mexico. The Department of Justice Inspector General report confirms these facts. ATF's first contact with the Osorios and Morrison, however, did not occur until 3 months after Agent Zapata's murder. So again, information was there, but it was 3 months after Agent Zapata was murdered that the ATF first made contact. It's been more than 6 years since Agent Zapata was murdered in the ambush attack involving U.S. purchased and subsequently trafficked firearms. It's been nearly 5 years since the probe was requested. Today, we want to examine ATF's past practices with respect to investigating straw purchasers and firearms trafficking cases. We've had the ATF here on a couple different occasions dealing with these issues, and yet we are concerned that these problems are still happening. ATF must enforce the existing laws and aggressively stop illegally purchased and possessed firearms. Repeated excuses that the U.S. Attorney Office will not prosecute or that heightened probable cause is necessary, I think should be rejected. You know, I think we do have a further problem with prosecutors prosecuting gun crimes. In fact, this committee is anticipating having hearings on that very subject. It's frustrating not only at the ATF level, but it's frustrating with the TSA. I mean, every day we're taking guns off of airplanes, and yet go try to find a case that's prosecuted. It's rare to none. Seems to be virtually no consequence. And today we aim to bring renewed focus on the incident for not only the Zapata family, but also those other families who serve in our nation and the overall general well-being of the United States of America. We invited ATF Deputy Director Ronald Turk and Special Agent in Charge William Temple to testify today because they can provide some of the answers the Zapata family and their public deserve. The Justice Department doesn't think we need to hear from them. You'll notice that there are 5 seats there, and only 2 have bothered to show up. You know, when Congress, certainly the Oversight Committee, invites you to testify, it's not optional. It's not an exercise of whether or not it's convenient. They will show up, and we'll get to that in a moment. Mr. Temple is the head of the Dallas Field Office, the special agent in charge, and he can provide a unique perspective. He's in the field, one of the most challenging environments for fighting firearms trafficking, and in light of the serious problems that we covered in this IG report, we have to hear from the ATF officials outside of Washington. I'm tired of hearing from just management. I want to hear from the people that are actually on the front lines doing this. As you notice, Mr. Temple is not here either. Department of Justice continues to insist we shouldn't talk to Mr. Turk or Mr. Temple. And I'm going to get back to that later as we go to the questioning. We want to encourage ATF and other law enforcement agencies to place more emphasis on taking down criminals and their tools before they work their will. No law passed by Congress can require federal law enforcement officers to simply do their job. It is tough. It is difficult. It is. I've been on a lot of ride-alongs. I blow in and out in a few hours. They do this day in and day out. They need to know that we got their back. We got their support. We love for them. We love them. We care for them. And if there are problems and challenges that are happening at the front line, we need to know it. Can't get that perspective if when we ask them to be here, some management person says, no, they really don't need to be here. I speak for the agency. I speak for the mass. That's not the way this is going to work. Certainly not going to work in this Congress. It doesn't work for me. So I think the 2 that are here, but Mr. Brandon, you got some questions to answer about why people that work for you aren't here. And we'll get to that in the questioning. And as for Mr. Kraft, You know, when you work as an AUSA, Assistant U.S. Attorney, again, we're going to have some hard discussions with the Department of Justice because they're not above oversight either, and they will be here in the future as well. I've gone well past my time. Let me now recognize Ms. Maloney of New York for her opening statement.
I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing and thank him for his sensitivity for the sacrifice of law enforcement and the pain of families. This is an important hearing. When Special Agent Jaime Zapata was shot and killed in Mexico in February of 2011, he was only 32 years old. He was as enthusiastic and hardworking as any law enforcement agent can be. 6 years ago, this remarkable young man was murdered in an ambush while working in service of his nation. His partner, Special Agent Victor Avila, was gravely injured alongside him. Examining the circumstances of Agent Zapata's death and the shooting of Agent Avila required a thorough and diligent investigation by the Office of Inspector General. I thank Mr. Horowitz and his staff for the report we are discussing today. This report identifies a number of serious problems in the way that ATF, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the U.S. Attorney's Office investigated the trafficking of weapons to Mexico in 2010 and 2011. Many of these issues are not new to us on this committee. We have investigated them over and over again for several years, and we have worked to ensure that these agencies make serious and lasting improvements. The IG's report highlights some very important new facts. For example, it describes how a federal prosecutor in Texas made a very serious mistake in agreeing to release a man by the name of Manuel Barba from federal custody in July of 2010. According to the IG, that prosecutor had DEA reports with Mr. Barba claiming that he was heavily involved in drug trafficking. The IG found that this decision had terrible consequences, and I quote, "Based on the information reasonably knowable to the agents and the prosecutors, it is clear that they should not have agreed to Barba's release from federal custody and left at liberty to direct the straw purchase of one of the assault weapons and its trafficking to Mexico, where it was used in the Zapata-Avila shooting," end quote. This prosecutor's supervisor, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas, admitted later, and I quote, "We dropped the ball." Well, I've got to say that this Congress has dropped the ball in its support of law enforcement. We had testimony before this committee on Fast and Furious where the agent said, "Give us a tough anti-drug trafficking law." And this committee, I authored along with Chairman Cummings a bill that just did that, made it a felony. They said we don't even bother to prosecute it because it's just a slap on the wrist. And give us the tools. I will say I'm proud that it's the one bill addressing gun safety that has bipartisan support. I am reintroducing it again today with Republican support. It is the only gun safety bill that the NRA has not come out against because it makes so much sense, and practically every law enforcement agency in the country has endorsed this bill. And I would venture to say we have hearings about it, but it involves illegal trafficking of guns. And I hope that some members of this committee will join me and the chairman in having a hearing on the bill and actually doing something to keep these guns out of criminals' hands. Now the IG's report also disproved an unfounded assertion made by Republicans on this committee at the time. They claimed that Agents Zapata and Avila may have been shot with guns that were so-called walked as part of Operation Fast and Furious. These claims have turned out to be wrong. Let me be clear. This new information in no way diminishes our committee's obligation to ask tough questions and demand answers, but it does caution against members rushing to judgment without all the facts. With that in mind, today we will also discuss a recent New York Times article alleging that ATF failed to properly oversee so-called, and I quote, churning accounts between 2011 and 2013 while investigating cigarette smuggling. In 2003, the Justice Department, under Attorney General John Ashcroft, argued in favor of allowing ATF to use churning accounts, asserting that Congress should give ATF authority to use money generated during undercover sting operations to offset their investigative expenses. In response, Congress granted this authority in 2004, and President Bush signed it into law. In 2013, the IG issued a report highlighting numerous accountability problems with these churning accounts between 2006 and 11. In response, ATF says that it stopped using these accounts. The New York Times article alleges that this latest operation, and I quote, not authorized under Justice Department rules and went beyond what was identified in that audit released in 2013, end quote. We do not have the full story yet. The chairman asked ATF to submit documents, but the due date is not until tomorrow. In addition, litigation referenced in the press report is under seal. Documents on the public docket are heavily redacted, and it's unclear whether ATF has submitted documents in that case. Nevertheless, if the allegations in this press report are true, they raise serious questions. Who authorized it? How was the money used? Did this activity violate department guidelines? Has there been an audit of these accounts to determine whether funds were used improperly? Has anyone been disciplined? And how were the activities described in this report any different than straight-out tobacco smuggling? We will not rush to judgment, but we will seek answers. We will review the documents, we will monitor the litigation to determine whether the case is unsealed, and we will question today's witnesses. Also, Congress has a role. More than 5 years ago, several ATF whistleblowers testified at that very witness table about abuses that they saw firsthand. They called for legislation to make gun trafficking a serious federal crime. They explained that the current penalties for gun trafficking are no more than paperwork violations, and they called them, and I quote, toothless, end quote. In response, I authored legislation in the past 2 Congresses. Our legislation was bipartisan. It had more than 100 co-sponsors from both political parties. It targeted criminals and, most importantly, helped law enforcement do their job. They asked for this. They endorsed it. It was endorsed by local, federal, state police groups, as well as prosecutor organizations with members across this country. Yet our bill received absolutely no action in this House. I will reintroduce it today, and I hope the chairman will grant the request of the ranking member for a hearing so that we can look at solving the problem of gun trafficking that is often with drug cartels and gangs and criminals. And I think it's a very important piece of legislation. It can save lives and prevent guns from getting into hands of criminals that kill good agents such as Jaime Zapata. My time has expired. I thank the chairman for calling this important hearing, and I hope he will grant our request for a hearing on the bill.
Gentlewoman yields back. Thank the gentlewoman. We'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who'd like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. We're pleased to welcome the Honorable Michael Horowitz, Inspector General the United States Department of Justice. We thank you and all the people that work with you for your service. One of the things we would like you to address, though, is why in the world it took so long to get to this point. It seems excessively long, but again, you have a very storied and rich career in serving our country, and we thank you for that. Mr. Thomas Brandon is the Acting Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. Again, we thank you for your service, both in the military, the United States Marines, but also at ATF and working on behalf of the United States of America in a very difficult but very important job, and we thank you again for your service and for your being here today. As you know, pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn before they testify, so if you will please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that both witnesses answered in the affirmative. We'll give you some latitude, but we would appreciate it if you limit your oral testimony to roughly 5 minutes. Again, we'll give you great latitude here, but your entire written statement and any supporting documents will be made part of the record. Mr. Horowitz, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify at today's important hearing. On February 15, 2011, ICE Special Agents Victor Avila and Jaime Zapata were attacked by members of a drug cartel while working in Mexico. Tragically, Agent Zapata did not survive the attack, while Agent Avila was seriously injured. 2 firearms used in that attack were traced to purchases in Texas made by Otilio Osorio and Robert Rindfleisch, both of whom were connected to then ongoing DOJ criminal investigations. Our review examined the information that the ATF, DEA, FBI, and the Department of Justice obtained about the illegal narcotics and gun trafficking activities of Osorio, Rindfleisch, and their associates prior to the attack on Agents Zapata and Avila. Our review of ATF's investigation of Osorio, his brother Ranferi Osorio, and neighbor Kelvin Morrison found numerous problems with the timeliness of ATF's response to mounting evidence that the individuals were committing firearms trafficking offenses. We found that ATF had collected sufficient information prior to Osorio's purchase on October 10, 2010, of the firearm that was later used in the attack on Agent Zapata and Avila to justify questioning his brother and Morrison or taking other investigative steps regarding their firearms purchases. Our review also found that approximately 1 month after Osorio's firearm purchase, the Osorio brothers were recorded transferring 40 firearms, 37 with obliterated serial numbers. Despite this information, ATF's first contact with the Osorios and Morrison did not occur until late February 2011, following the attack on the agents. In addition, our review identified one instance which occurred after the attacks on Agents Avila and Zapata, where we believe ATF had both the legal authority and opportunity to seize firearms in the Osorio's possession, but did not. 2 of the firearms that could have been seized were later recovered at a crime scene in Mexico. We concluded that the ATF supervisor in the Dallas Field Division was not sufficiently proactive and failed to ensure that all of ATF's leads were investigated, that consultations with prosecutors were started, and that there was adequate coordination within ATF and with the DEA. We further determined that ATF delayed its investigation and arrests of the Osorios and Morrison for reasons that lacked sufficient justification. We also identified serious deficiencies with DEA's handling of its narcotics investigation of Manuel Barba, the person who trafficked the firearm purchased by Rindfleisch. The DEA uncovered information about Barba's potential gun trafficking in May 2010, yet never shared it with ATF. As a result, ATF only learned of Barba's gun trafficking as a result of its own investigation in August 2010, after the sale of the Rindfleisch firearm. We further determined that the AUSA handling the DEA narcotics prosecution of Barba should not have agreed to Barba's release from jail in July 2010 following his arrest. That decision left Barba at liberty to lead a group of firearms traffickers and direct the straw purchase and trafficking of the Rindfleisch firearm to Mexico. We were not persuaded by DEA's explanations for not passing on evidence of Barba's firearms trafficking activities to ATF, and we determined that there's room for improvement in DEA's policy to clearly require such communication in appropriate circumstances. As part of our oversight work concerning ATF's Operation Fast and Furious, we previously encouraged DEA to develop policies that provide clear guidance to its agents about when to contact ATF, but to date, DEA has not implemented that recommendation. With respect to ATF's own investigation of Barba and Rindfleisch, we found that ATF agents in that investigation diligently pursued leads, took effective investigative steps, and appropriately consulted and coordinated their activities with prosecutors. We did not identify any failure to take action by the ATF agents that might reasonably have prevented the trafficking of the Rindfleisch firearm. We did not make formal recommendations in this report because we believe our recommendations in the Operation Fast and Furious review that we did and in our recent follow-up review on the Operation Fast and Furious recommendations were sufficient to address the deficiencies we found in this review. We look forward to working with this committee and the department to address the concerns identified in all of our reviews with regard to gun trafficking, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brandon, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General reports titled Review of Investigations of the Osario and Barber Firearms Trafficking Rings and ATF's Use of Income-Generating Undercover Operations. I appreciate the work of the OIG in these matters. We agree with all of the findings in both reports, and ATF has implemented all of the recommendations from the 2013 report. I will continue to work closely with the Inspector General to further improve ATF. Before addressing those matters, however, I want to express the deep-felt condolences of all the men and women of ATF to the family, friends, and colleagues of Special Agents Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila for the loss and suffering they have endured. Anytime a law enforcement officer is lost in a line of duty, is it a tragedy that affects everyone. And over my career, I have had friends and colleagues killed in the line of duty. And every morning I contemplate the sacrifice that law enforcement officers have made on my behalf and on behalf of all Americans. I make my decisions as ATF's acting director with this in mind. Mr. Chairman, you know that I'm a career special agent. I'm not a political appointee. I've worked the streets in Detroit, LA, and Phoenix. I understand the impact the law enforcement career has on a family. So when I say that every day ATF special agents, investigators, and professional staff work tirelessly to remove the most violent offenders from the streets and make our communities safer, I speak from the heart and the very essence of my being. I have been there myself. It's not a talking point for me. It has been my life, and I am honored and proud to lead the men and women of ATF. Leadership requires from time to time that we turn inward and examine ourselves. The DOJ OIG has helped us do that. I have closely read the OIG report on the Osario and Barber gun trafficking rings, and I thank the Inspector General for the thorough assessments of the events involved in those investigations. In particular, the OIG pointed out where ATF could make improvements to communications and information dissemination. ATF could and should have done better. We make no excuses, and I accept full responsibility for the lapses in 2010 and 2011. These events occurred more than 7 years ago, before substantial leadership changes were implemented at ATF. The ATF of 2017 is not the ATF of 2010. Let me tell you how ATF has changed since that time. Since my arrival as the ATF Deputy Director in the fall of 2011, I've brought a laser focus to enhancing communication, operational oversight, and accountability to ensure that our investigations are effective, focused, and efficiently executed. In particular, hard lessons have taught us that the level of complexity involved in firearms trafficking investigations demand constant organizational vigilance, management oversight, and that effective communication is essential to success in these high-stakes cases. To meet these demands, ATF has implemented a broad range of organizational improvements during my tenure. These improvements include implementation of Frontline, it's ATF's intelligence-led, risk-based business model, establishment of crime gun intelligence centers in every ATF field division, focused hiring of intelligence research specialists with an emphasis on those with military experience, establishment of a formal ATF internal communications plan, enhancement of ATF's monitored case program, enhancement of mandatory leadership command and control training for first-line supervisors and management, and mandatory training for all agents on firearms trafficking techniques. I want to assure the committee for that as long as I'm privileged to lead ATF, we will continue to identify areas where we can further strengthen our operational effectiveness. I also understand the committee's interest in recent media reports regarding ATF tobacco investigation. That investigation is the subject of an ongoing federal civil lawsuit, and the court has sealed the case pending trial. The United States is a party to that litigation, and therefore the court's order is binding on ATF and me. Consequently, my ability to respond to questions specific to that investigation is extremely limited at this time. What I can advise the committee is that the OIG conducted a full program audit of ATF's income-generating undercover activities beginning in 2011 and issued a comprehensive report in September 2013. That report, which evaluated the period of 2006 to 2011, identified serious deficiencies in ATF's policies and controls over those investigations. Before the OIG issued the report, ATF had internally recognized the need for more robust policies, procedures, and oversight on income-generating undercover activity investigations and had begun implementing enhancements in 2011. In April 2013, ATF issued a comprehensive order governing tobacco investigations, including strict rules on the use of income-generating undercover activities. ATF is not currently using this technique and has not done so since 2013 and will not do so in the future unless very specific and limited parameters are met. ATF has closed all of these bank accounts and deposited all remaining funds from those accounts in the U.S. Treasury General Fund. Beyond implementation and strict enforcement of the April 2013 order, as noted, ATF has implemented all of the OIG's 2013 recommendations, and as a result, by October 2015, the OIG has closed all of its recommendations. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I am proud to be here today representing the men and women of ATF. They work diligently every day to keep our community safer. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Brandon, you have been the acting director for a year and 11 months now, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Turk and Mr. Temple work for you?
They do.
Why are they not here?
When we received the request, the invitation to testify, Mr. Chairman, I met with my team, consulted with DOJ, and wanted to quickly respond by having someone here from ATF, and that person would be me.
But the invitation was to yourself, Mr. Turk, and Mr. Temple, and you unilaterally decided that Mr. Turk and Mr. Temple would not be here?
No, I did not.
Who decided that Mr. Turk and Mr. Temple were not going to be here?
Well, the decision is theirs voluntarily. To let you know, Mr. Chairman, I didn't order them not to be here, and no one that I know of from the department ordered them not to be here.
So they personally chose not to be here?
That's their free decision, but also I agreed with it. I'm not going to duck anything here.
So they just decided that coming before Congress was an optional activity and that they were not going to do it. I think I understand. You understand that I have, do you know what a subpoena is, Mr. Brandon?
Yes, I do.
What does a subpoena require you to do?
To appear before the court or the legislative body in this case.
See this subpoena right here? I don't have to ask a judge. I don't need to get a vote here. We are now hereby subpoenaing here's one for Mr. Turk. He's to testify before this committee in a deposition on March 21st. Is there any reason he cannot attend at that time?
I don't believe so.
He will be served this subpoena. Mr. Temple, he's going to present himself for a deposition, which is a much more difficult thing than appearing before Congress. These things go on for hours under oath. Any reason he can't be here on March 22nd at 10 a.m.?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And you're the director, you're the acting director, so you can help make sure that his schedule is free to be here at that time?
I will make sure of that.
I just issued a subpoena for Mr. Temple as well. He will present himself before this committee. These are not optional exercises. Now, Mr. Kraft was given a little bit shorter notice. We're going to have that discussion with the Department of Justice. He was the minority witness that was requested by Mr. Cummings to be here. His non-presence is also totally and wholly unacceptable, and we'll figure out how to best move forward on him. These are not optional exercises. You're wasting this committee's time by allowing Mr. Turk and Mr. Temple to think anything other than when they're invited to come to Congress, they will come to Congress. And when I send you a notice on Thursday of last week for you to contact your department, your agency, your people, for them to contact our office last night in the 5 o'clock hour is totally and wholly unacceptable. There is no excuse for that, and we will not tolerate that. And if I need to issue a subpoena at the get-go, you tell me. We will do that every time because they should have been here today. And if you had given us the proper notice, as was laid out in the letter, which says that you will contact the committee by March 6th, which you did not, then we would have issued a subpoena and they'd be here today and we'd have a more full and complete hearing. And everybody in this audience, and especially the Zapata family, could hear from these people. Do we understand each other?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we do, and I apologize if there was a communication as late as yesterday. I was under the understanding that there was communication, and if there was a subpoena, obviously they would be here, but I hear you loud and clear.
Chairman, would you yield?
Yes, I
for a second? Mr. Brandon, I think the thing that concerned me more is when you said you agreed with the decision of them not to come. You understand the significance of a subpoena, do you not? And a request that your agents be here. But you just sat there and said you agreed with their decision. So apparently there was some back and forth. And you being their boss, I'm just trying to figure out, what part you played in all of that, because that bothers me. It also bothers me that, that the late getting back to us. I mean, I think we try to accommodate. But when we get a response the evening before, that's kind of rough. But tell me what part you played. And I just want to be clear on this.
Oh, thank you, sir.
You're their boss now, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
We got the invitations, not subpoenas, and I was told that normally we would get more time to respond within a 14-day rule. We wanted to absolutely appear here and be prepared. And that in talking to the department, which had a lot of things going on with hearings, that this was the proper way to handle.
But you said you agreed. You said you agreed with the decision for them not to be here. See, that puts us in a kind of awkward position. We got the boss who says, okay, guys, you don't have to show up. And that sends a hell of a message. That's a problem. Come on now.
It was meant to be not anything disrespectful to this committee and trying to say, okay, who is going to represent the agency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jaime Zapata was killed about 6 years ago. There's been an investigation nearly 5 years. When did you get the report from the Department of Justice, the Inspector General? How long ago did you get the initial draft of the report?
The members of my team received the report, and it was the back and forth with edits, and I received it, I believe, approximately a month ago to read it.
Mr. Horwitz, do you have a more specific time?
I can get you a more specific time, but it would probably be about a month to 6 weeks ago if I can check and just get a more.
So your excuse that you needed more time, that it just ain't flying. Okay? When you had to know that we were deeply interested in this. And if you get the report 4 to 6 weeks ago, you're going back and forth with edits. My understanding is that members of the ATF actually got a draft in December. Mr. Horwitz?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. It was
So you
December.
get it in December, and now your complaint is you didn't have enough time to prepare for this hearing. And that's why, in part, we invited Mr. Temple here, because my concern is 6 years after we had an American killed, an agent killed, that you all haven't got the lesson. So don't tell me that you need more time, because if you can't communicate to Congress that you get it and that you're implementing the changes, my guess is all those men and women, the thousands of people out in the field, they haven't gotten the message either. And that's the concern. That's the concern. Y'all try to dress it up so that you come to Congress and put the best looking picture it can. We want the raw truth of what's happening, what those men and women are having to deal with on the front lines. So the idea that you needed more time, we didn't get the customary 2 weeks, is a load of crap. And you know it, because you've had this since December. And that's my frustration. I could go on, but my time has expired. We'll now recognize Ms. Maloney of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Brandon to respond to my comments concerning really Congress not giving you the tools that you need to get the job done. When Congress first began working on this, and we were looking into the shooting death of Agenct Zapata in 2012, we were already in 2011, I believe it was. We were already in the midst of an investigation of the so-called Operation Fast and Furious, and that was the botched attempt to target gun traffickers connected to Mexican drug cartels. And we had whistleblowers testify, sitting right where you are right now, Mr. Brandon, and then they asked us to give them the tools to get the job done. I can remember it like yesterday. He said, we don't even bother to go after serious gun traffickers because there's no enforcement, and even if you caught them, you can't do anything to them. It's just a paper violation. Quote, a paper violation. Give us the tools, make it a felony, make it a crime, and crack down on these straw purchasers who buy guns for criminals and then use them to kill our agents. Well, we did. Mr. Cummings and I, along with members of the Republican Party and actually Senator Duckworth, she was then a member of this committee, we drafted a bill that cracked down, and it's been universally endorsed by law enforcement across the country. Now, that was 5 years ago. So I'd like to ask Mr. Brandon, is it true that today there is no such dedicated statute targeting gun trafficking? Is gun trafficking still just a paper violation, as your agent testified before us 5 years ago?
Yes, ma'am. Nothing's changed.
And how big a problem is it? That makes guns flow easily, not only through Mexico, but probably throughout the world. I was talking to a representative from the Caribbean. They say guns flow all over the Caribbean from the U.S., but there's no law against it. Is that correct?
That's true, ma'am, and there's no doubt a firearms trafficking statute would help deal with the gun violence in America.
Then I really want to ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join Ranking Member Cummings and other members of this committee. Ms. Kelly was very active in it, as there was a lot of violence in the district that she represents. And I, for one, thought after we had Newtown, when the 23 young children were killed, that we would act on gun violence. But the one bill that has bipartisan support and the one bill that law enforcement has come out almost universally in support of is give us the tools to do the job. So my question is, if we did make that a federal felony, if we did crack down on straw purchases, would that help you? Would that help our law enforcement, not just ATF, but all law enforcement do their job in a better way to protect people?
Yes, ma'am, it would, in my opinion, absolutely.
Now, the bill was supported by the American Bar Association, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, Major Cities Chiefs Association, but most importantly, in my mind, the police and fire that are on the front line in the district that I represent across this country. So let me ask you, Mr. Brandon, how serious is the problem of gun trafficking along the southwest border today? Has the concern in any way gone away?
The concern is not. We at ATF, without having that statute and with the laws that we enforce, have given credit for agents to have interdiction and deterrence of firearms rather than waiting for building a criminal case and where guns can get to the criminal element and be misused to shoot and hurt people. We're doing the best with what we have, and so with interdiction and deterrence, we refer to it as being on the left side of boom. and that's one of the strategies we have taken. But firearms trafficking along the southwest border and across the United States still is a problem.
Well, it's one that we can address. And for all of the talk of building a wall that may cost tens of billions of dollars along the southwest border, there is remarkably little talk about passing this law, which costs nothing. This would cost nothing to the taxpayer to enact this law, which then would give our law enforcement the ability to better protect the American people. And it seems to me that it's just common sense. And our chairman is a common sense guy, so I hope he will join the ranking member and myself, and I'd say many members on this side of the aisle and on the Republican side of the aisle. It's interesting, all of the Republican prosecutors, they know the problem, so they're co-sponsors of this. And we could do a big step forward in combating violent crime on the border in Mexico, and really the exporting of guns and really the use of guns by criminals. Even if you sell one to a drug cartel, a criminal, a murderer, or whatever, there's no penalty for it. And I got to think that if we made it a penalty, and our bill has a 20-year visit to jail if you do so knowingly, then we could cut down on this violence. How many agents do we have to be killed by illegal guns that are sold to bad people because there's no enforcement against gun trafficking? It's a simple thing to do. We could pass it. I join the ranking member in really pleading for a hearing on this bill that we've had in for 2 different Congresses now for 4 years, and we're reintroducing it today. I think it could help us solve the problem and give law enforcement stronger tools to crack down on the bad guys that are buying these illegal guns and using them in terrible ways to kill people, including our own agents. My time has expired.
Thank the gentleman.
But I feel very strongly about this, and I'm very frustrated because I'd like to see some action. I'd like to see this bill passed.
Thank the gentlewoman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, this committee depends in a significant way on work by inspectors general, and you've done very good work for this committee in the past. But I noticed that on March 8th, 2011, the Department of Justice referred questions about the firearms recovered at the scene of Mr. Zapata's death on March 8th, 2011, and then on September 19th, 2012, Senator Grassley wrote a letter to ask these same questions, yet your report didn't come out until March 1st, 2017. I think several of us are concerned about that length of time, that delay.
Yes, we got the request and the referral from this committee and Chairman Grassley in September 2012, and the bottom line is there's no excuse. We should have gotten it done more promptly. I could tell you about some of the staffing issues we had and challenges we had on the Barba piece of the report. We learned some new information later on in the investigation that I think is important to the story here, but the bottom line is ultimately, I agree with you, Congressman, and we've talked internally and are taking steps to make sure we can get these out more time.
All right, well, good. Do you believe there was probable cause to arrest both of the Serio brothers and their neighbor Kelvin Morrison after the ATF witnessed the completion of a transfer of 40 firearms on November 9th, 2010?
That is what we found in our report, and I agree with you, Congressman.
Mr. Brandon, you said a few minutes ago that you were told this was, I think the word you used, that this was a proper way to handle this, and telling the Mr. Turk and Mr. Temple that this was up to them or something. Who told you this was the proper way to handle this?
I was speaking with attorneys within ATF and also with members from the legislative affairs at DOJ.
Can you tell us specifically the people that told you that this was the proper way to handle this?
Well, I had my chief of staff, Joe Allen, communicating with the department, and like I said, that with everything going on, it was communication wasn't the best. I will say to you, and on respect to you and Mr. Chaffetz, as far as referring to it as crap, had I known this was the feeling coming down, and also to you, Mr. Cummings, that this was your feelings, that would be a different thing. I would say, well, hey, an invitation's really a subpoena. There's no option here. And so I just want to clarify that to you, that it was no disrespect for me as a leader in trying to shove it to the committee. That's absolutely not the truth. We've been trying to run to the truth. And so I just want to make that clear of the intent and to look you right in the eyes, Mr. Chairman, because I see you glaring at me, that that is absolutely not how it went down. And if an invitation, how I'm taking this, and clear interpretation from you, is an invitation is really a subpoena. It's not an option. I get it. And they'd be sitting here. And so I just wanted to say I apologize for not having that political understanding of this, and also with saying I was trying to hide behind something 2 weeks. I'm not a hiding type guy. And so I'm basically, it wasn't BS. And I just wanted to share that with all of you.
All right, well, let me get to one other thing before my time runs out. The Inspector General found that the Dallas Field Division simply failed to do its job. The report says the supervisor of ATF's Dallas Firearms Group was not sufficiently proactive and failed to ensure that the leads the ATF had received about Aserio and Morrison were investigated and that consultations with prosecutors had started. What do you say about that?
Sir, I agree with the OIG, Mr. Horowitz, and his team. We had a supervisor that is retired that was over our firearms trafficking, that was asleep at the switch, and totally agree with it, that the findings of the OIG.
And have you taken steps to see that something like this doesn't happen again in the future?
Yes, sir. I mean, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we developed a frontline, intelligence-led, risk-based way of doing business. One of the things, key component of that, is each division, we have 25 of them around the country, has to do a domain assessment. And they have to share that domain assessment with the U.S. Attorney. And that's an important part because of the communication that was lacking. And if we're out of step with the U.S. Attorney's Office, if we're not in step, we're out of step. And we don't want to waste our limited investigative time, resources, and time if they're not going to be prosecuted. So to share that with you, sir, that's how we've tightened it up. And that was implemented in the beginning of 2012. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I welcome the panel. I would just say to you, Mr. Brandon, on a bipartisan basis, I mean, when executive branch officials are invited to testify before Congress, it is an invitation, but it is also an obligation. And I appreciate what you've said, but I don't think it ought to require a subpoena to get the executive branch to be accountable to the legislative branch. That's our constitutional system. And we don't want to go down that road. I don't think we want to set the precedent that the only way we can compel your testimony is by subpoena. I'm sure you would agree.
Sir, yes, I totally agree. And had I understood this storm coming down on me right now, they'd be sitting here.
Okay. You are the acting director of the ATF. In the last 10 years, how many confirmed directors have there been of the ATF?
I'm sorry, sir, in how many years?
In the last decade.
There's only been one. It was
one. And how recently was that?
I believe it was July 31st, 2013. It was B. Todd Jones, my former boss.
So for most of the decade, we've had acting directors. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And the reason for that is what?
Well, it's presidentially nominated, Senate confirmed.
And the Senate gave it the slows.
Well, I would say that the process is slow.
What's happened to your budget?
Well, like many in the federal government, you could do more with more. And the budget with ATF is tight. And in candor, sir, what I refer to here being up in D.C. is what is decimal dust to the federal budget of if 50 million to 100 million extra ATF, we can make a significant input with technology to help our state and local.
But I mean, in the last 6, 7 years, I mean, we're so concerned about things like Fast and Furious and the tragic death of Mr. Zapata. We've certainly beefed up your budget with additional resources, have we not?
No, sir. No, our budget's been eroding.
Really, eroding. So we don't want to confirm a director, at least not very often. We've deliberately left the organization, with no disrespect to you or your predecessors who were in acting capacity, but the proper form is to have a confirmed director of the agency. We've actually reduced the resources available to you, and as Ms. Maloney just pointed out, despite testimony, and your testimony is consistent with other agents who have sat here, including, I remember one hearing where I believe it was the agent from Phoenix who said, yeah, that would be a tool we want. And I remember the then chairman, not this chairman, actually interfering with the testimony because he didn't like the answer and actually started to direct the answer. It seems to me that we can't have it both ways in Congress. If we want you to do your job and do it well, and we want to achieve the goals the agency has and has set for especially the southern part of our border, it seems to me we have to do our jobs. And I'm not sure we've consistently done that. You can comment or not, Mr. Brandon.
No, sir. Look, I have a lot of friends, Democrats and Republicans, and I'll say raise your hand if you're in favor of gun violence, and I've never seen a hand go up. It's an American issue. It's not a DNR issue.
Yeah, but it's quite another matter if we're willing to do something about it.
Oh, I agree. That's what you guys are here for.
Mr. Horowitz, your office issued recommendations from the Operation Fast and Furious review in 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did ATF make major improvements pursuant to those recommendations?
The ATF, as we noted in last year's follow-up review, made significant changes to their policies and practices.
Anything glaring that still needs to be resolved?
Not from ATF.
Not from ATF. Okay. Your office also issued a report reviewing. Well, you reviewed the implementation and found, and it was a favorable report.
As to ATF.
As to ATF, who is not favorable?
There were two outstanding recommendations, one with regard to the FBI, which had not put in place a policy regarding allowing when guns should or shouldn't be seized, and DEA regarding notifications, among other things, regarding notifications to ATF, which played itself out in this case that we are here today to talk about.
Thank you. Mr. Brandon, final point, but I've got 10 seconds. Thank you for your service. Thank you to the men and women of the agency. I just hope Congress will back you up. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
And right on time. I'm highly impressed. So you got constituents in the crowd, and just for the note to tell you how on time that Mr. Conley is, at least today. So this is good.
I thank the chair for his praise.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Farenthold of Texas, and I think as he will tell you, Mr. Zapata was a constituent of Blake Farenthold. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's when I was first elected in 2010. I had the privilege of representing the Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville, and Agent Zapata and his family grew up in Brownsville. So this is a very important issue to me. Before I get started, though, I do want to address one or two things Mr. Conley had said, and the first of which is I think the Senate does need to be much more speedy in their confirmation process, and would urge Mr. Conley to speak to some members of his party over there about that, as we're in the middle of quite a few confirmations now. Mr. Brandon, you also testified that you could do more with more resources, and I think everybody that I regularly associate with Congress wants to give our law enforcement agencies, be it yours or the others, the tools necessary to do what they need to do. But I would imagine you wouldn't want to see your taxes go up significantly to fund that either.
No, sir, I'm fiscally conservative.
As much as we would like to, there are a lot of things we've got to do in this government, and that's why we're asking you and the fine men and women to work for you to do more with less, just like we're asking the vast majority of the government to do the same. But let me get along to my lines of questioning. And I don't want to pound on about the fact that the other folks aren't here, but I want to explain the frustration that this committee faces. We faced 6 years of stonewalling, a lot of which has to do with Fast and Furious, to the point that we held the former Attorney General in contempt of Congress and pursued litigation against him and to obtain documents for the Department of Justice. So there is a frustration here that we would hope would start to evaporate with new leadership in the executive branch. Obviously, we're early on in there, and we don't have folks confirmed. But this stonewalling does nothing but cost the taxpayers dollars and deny the American people the opportunity to have good oversight of their government. So that again, not pounding on. I just wanted to explain that frustration to you and where we're coming from. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on now in the report. Let me start with Mr. Horowitz. Let's talk a little bit about Fast and Furious and the gun running operation. Can you, in roughly a minute, tell me what we've learned and what still needs to be done as a result of your investigation into this? Just bullet points.
Yeah. So with regard to Fast and Furious, our follow-up review, and now this review, I think the couple of open recommendations that still are out there involve, in particular on this matter, on the Barba side of the case, we found once again that one federal law enforcement agency, in this case DEA, failed to tell another law enforcement agency, in this case ATF, about gun trafficking activity that it knew about. That failure was, in our view, significant and important and should not have occurred, and DEA needs to have a policy in place that ensures that its agents...
Okay, we have fusion centers everywhere designed to get around. What are we not doing? I mean, I've been to multiple fusion centers where you guys are supposed to be talking to each other.
Yeah, look, I think that's a concern. We saw that, as you'll recall, in Fast and Furious between ICE and ATF, the lack of sharing of information. It is an issue that continues to arise, and as these centers exist, it needs to be addressed and overcome. There's no excuse for it.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions and not a lot of time. Mr. Brandon, I want to ask you to reassure me that we don't have any programs like Fast and Furious going on now where we're letting weapons move across borders in attempt to get the bigger guy. Have we learned that lesson?
Yes, sir. And one of our things for responding to that was a monitored case program that I have every month. And these cases, which anything dealing with international trafficking, are briefed up to me. One of the things that we put in there is progress plans and problems. And if a problem is identified of communication, it's to communicate, collaborate, and deconflict. And from the briefings to me, in which I'm very actively involved because I was a street agent in the field, got shot at, and all the other stuff, so I'm not a suit
And let's talk about getting shot at, too. What programs have we, if any, Mr. Horowitz, have we implemented with respect to our various law enforcement agents detailed to countries with high drug violence like Mexico to ensure that they're safe? At the time of the Zapata shooting, they were unarmed due to our policies in dealing with Mexico. Has anything changed where our agents are able to carry weapons or they're escorted by Mexican agents who are armed?
I know there remain issues with regard to that, Congressman. If I could get back to you on that and follow up, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, your report identified serious deficiencies in the actions of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Texas against the drug and firearms trafficker named Manuel Barba. Specifically, according to your report, and I quote, the assistant U.S. attorney handling the Barber drug prosecution should not have agreed to Barber's release from federal custody in July 2010, following his indictment and ultimate plea in the Eastern District of Texas, leaving him at liberty to lead the Baytown crew and ultimately direct the straw purchase and trafficking of the firearm to Mexico, end of quote. Apparently, the DEA had recorded statements of Mr. Barber saying that he planned to traffic 20 AK-47s, and those statements were included in the DEA report. But your report found, quote, no evidence, end of quote, that the prosecutor, quote, read the DEA report that recited Barber's statements. Mr. Horowitz, that sounds like a serious mistake that had significant repercussions. Would you agree?
Yes.
I think they tell children, they measure children's progress in the first grade, and one of the things they measure is follow directions. Seems like you would read a document. Would you agree?
Yes.
So Mr. Barber was released following the prosecutor's motion in July 2010. About 1 month later, Mr. Barber's trafficking ring purchased a firearm that was later used in the Zapata shooting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So Mr. Barber wasn't rearrested until February of 2011. That's 7 months that he was free to operate his gun trafficking ring. 7 long months. So, Mr. Horowitz, do you know how many firearms were trafficked by Mr. Barber's ring during that 7-month period?
The information that we have currently, but would require further investigation to determine, is at least the 10 firearms purchased by Rindfleisch on August 20th. We can't rule out that there weren't others, but there are at least 10 post the July release.
So these were very serious findings, and I do commend your office for uncovering them. But I understand that the U.S. Attorney acknowledged that his office dropped the ball and made some changes to their policy around the release of defendants before securing their cooperation. Now, Mr. Horowitz, do you know whether the prosecutor who made this significant error was ever disciplined in any way for mishandling the Barber case? And you would agree that it was a mishandling, would you not?
I agree, and I don't know the answer as I sit here, but certainly we can follow up and get back.
How soon can you get back to me on that? Today? That should be easy.
Well, it depends on the department providing me the information. I don't have the information in my file, so we need to go to the Justice Department to get that and alert them to your request.
All right, Mr. Horowitz, I don't know if you are aware of this, but my staff did a little research on that prosecutor. And in 2013, the New York Post posted that same prosecutor who mishandled the Barber case, and he criticized Trayvon Martin on social media, called President Obama and I quote, the Llama Bomber, end of quote, and said that, I quote, Obama, why stupid people shouldn't vote, end of quote. That was the same prosecutor. Do you know whether the prosecutor was disciplined in that instance, or were you aware of any of that?
I was aware of it, and I'm limited in what I can say with regard to any personnel action in a public setting, so we'd have to have further discussions with you about that.
But it appears that the prosecutor still works in the office. We invited him to appear here today to provide him with an opportunity to respond to your findings and address what I think are very serious questions about his judgment. He declined. And I just, that kind of, when we are paying people to do the work of the federal government, and they have those kinds of attitudes, there's no place for that. It's just no place for it, and it concerns me greatly. And I don't mind saying it. I think President Obama is one of the most brilliant persons I have ever met, and very principled. And to these kind of comments simply have no place in our society. So I'll yield back on that.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brennan, how you holding up? Doing okay?
I've had better days.
Okay, all right. I don't want your, probably, even though I'm not familiar with it, your distinguished career to be defined in a few minutes here today. So I want to make sure that we're kind of starting over and getting some information here. You mentioned that you talked with your attorneys and chief of staff about the best decision, whether not to bring or advise Mr. Turk or Mr. Temple. Early on, you were pretty defined as far as saying you're agreeing with these decisions. Did you not get good counsel from attorneys or your chief of staff of talking about the importance of coming to testify before Congress?
From my opinion, sir, I believe that there was a misunderstanding of what an invitation is to come before you. Now I know, so I would weigh in differently, during that. But also, we're a component within DOJ, so we have to coordinate through the Department of Justice. And I want to be fair to them. These people were dealing with the DAG hearing and everything else. And so I take responsibility. I'm not going to duck it. As far as I thought it was the best thing to come. And you can see I'm plain spoken. I'm not a polished headquarters type person. And to answer your question, knowing what I know now, like I previously said, and to be respectful to this committee, I would have a different view of things weighing in.
You've made a couple comments about that. You're not a suit in D.C. You're more of a non-polished guy. You kind of like just do the job type personality. How long have you been the active director there, Mr. Brennan?
Well, if I may say, sir, to answer your question, since April 1st, I say that doesn't measure someone's intelligence or drive or commitment to do the job. I just say it's my style and who I am, and I try to be who I am. But since April 1st of 2015, I've been the acting director.
Sure, okay. So coming up on 2 years, that's, you understand the responsibility. That is, I mean, even though you may not be on the street, you're wearing a suit and tie, you understand the responsibility of being the director, right? The acting director?
I've been living and breathing it 7 days a week.
All right, so with that comes the responsibility of fulfilling the request or the obligation that comes with the position. My specific question today that I want to get into, 2 weeks ago, the committee requested documents on a North Carolina churning investigation reported on in the New York Times. Tomorrow is the deadline for that request. Can you tell me what steps have been taken to collect, identify, and produce those documents responsive to the committee's February 22nd letter?
Yes, sir. I have a team inside headquarters, and I actually pulled people off the street that have knowledge of these type of investigations and working through the weekend and everything to meet the document production that we're allowed to do.
I believe the New York Times also talked about, maybe even have written you guys about the informants receiving more than $1 million. Precisely how much did each informant receive?
Sir, then this is what I mentioned in my opening statement, and this is advice I have gotten through the attorneys as the U.S. government is named in that lawsuit, and the judge has it under seal, and I cannot comment before the committee.
Like you can't comment on the amounts?
I'm told not to comment on anything regarding litigation that the United States government is a party to.
So you can't say what the purpose of these payments were they profit or expenses paid on behalf of the government, whether all the money is properly accounted for, or were any of these payments in cash? So any of those questions you're telling me that you can't address at all?
Yes, sir, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, then let me switch to, I know you said earlier, can't go back to 2010. Let me talk about 2015 and 16. Can you tell me how many straw purchases of firearm trafficking cases did the ATF refer for prosecution in 2015 and 2016, respectively?
I do not have those numbers in front of me, but I will take them back and report back to the committee, sir.
So if you don't have those numbers, you would have any numbers as far as how many of those cases were ultimately prosecuted either. Is that correct?
I would be, with our system, I would be able to get that information too, as far as recommended for prosecution, and we track the ones that get prosecuted and convicted.
Sure. We've got a few more questions, but I'm just going to wrap it up with this one because my time is quickly expiring. What is ATF doing to ensure its agents coordinate with the prosecutors in U.S. attorneys' offices as early as possible in their investigations?
Thank you for the question. Part of what I mentioned about Frontline with our domain assessments, even for our strategic plan for the year, they have to coordinate. And an ATF agent can't open an investigation anymore. And this came after Fast and Furious. They have to coordinate with their supervisor, and then they have to note that they've consulted with an AUSA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you very much. First of all, to the Zapata family, please accept my condolences even at this late date. And I know it's even difficult to have to be revisiting this so many years later. Mr. Horowitz, this is basically for you. In light of the recent reporting of the ATF tobacco diversion case, I'd like to ask about the status of the recommendations in the IG's audit of ATF's churning operations. The audit was released in 2013?
That's correct.
How many of these recommendations are now closed out?
We made 17 recommendations, and all 17 are now closed out.
Good to hear. So, and there is no need for a follow-up then?
Well, there might have been, but we are informed, as the acting director said in his testimony, that the ATF has shut down their operations. So at this point, there would be nothing for us.
I want to tell you that we appreciate the work that you do and how important your function is. And having said that, I'd like to kind of bring us up to date on some questions that I have. Seems like every day that there's a new revelation about the contacts between this president's campaign and actually his administration and his associates and even his family and Russian officials. First, there were reports that former policy advisor Carter Page traveled to Moscow. It was denied, then it was admitted. But we've got indications that there have been interactions with both Page and Roger Stone and Rick Gates and Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn, now the Attorney General, the son-in-law Jared Kushner, even reports of Donald Jr. and J.D. Gordon. In light of this, I would like to ask you, do you realize that why Congress would be so very, very concerned about these things and these revelations that are coming to bear?
Well, just broadly speaking, I certainly understand why folks would have questions and about various issues.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, Senator Schumer recently sent his letter asking you to open an investigation into whether there have been any political interference with any ongoing DOJ investigation that is related to President Trump's campaign, transition, and administration's contact with Russia, as well as attempts by Russia to interfere with our election. And I'd like to add my strong support to Senator Schumer's request for an investigation of these matters. Can you tell me whether you will be investigating whether there was any political interference with any potential DOJ or FBI investigations on this matter?
Congresswoman, we have Senator Schumer's letter, a letter from other senators. We have the chairman's letter on a matter related to it, and we're reviewing that and deciding and considering what, if anything, we should be doing with regard to that matter.
Could you pledge to us that any investigation, if undertaken, will be fact-based and thorough, and that the American people will be informed to the extent that it is significant and possible and not a threat to our security at home?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Every piece of work we do with the two principles that every IG office operates under, which is independence and transparency. And if and when we do any work in that area, we would do the same thing that you've seen from us in the matters that we're here to testify about today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Horowitz. We are definitely thirsty and hungry for the truth in these matters. Mr. Bannon, let me just echo some of the concerns that were raised by my chairman and my ranking member as it relates to the absence of the two individuals that have been expected to be a part of this today. I think that's very unfortunate. I thank thank you for acknowledging the fact that perhaps this was a wrong call on your part, and I certainly hope that we have better cooperation in the near future. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentlewoman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just following up, because I think it's pretty unavoidable connecting some dots here, Fast and Furious and all of this. Of course, the program lasted from 09 to 11, allowing weapons from the U.S. to pass to suspected gun smugglers. We end up losing some 1,400 firearms during that, many of which end up being used in crimes, including the death of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry in December of 2010. All right, shortly after that, Fast and Furious ends, and then investigations begin, both with this committee and the House Judiciary Committee. And that is a fascinating process to me. Let me just highlight some of the issues that take place. In October 2011, documents are obtained after Eric Holder was subpoenaed. Documents is found that his testimony was inconsistent. He said he knew of Fast and Furious for only a few weeks. Documents revealed he knew over a year. February 2012, Holder tells this committee that firings and charges against DOJ officials who oversaw Fast and Furious are likely to come within 6 months, and he denies any cover-up involvement. June of that year, this committee recommends Holder to be held in contempt of Congress for failing to turn over documents that have been sought by the committee. On that same day, President Obama asserts executive privilege over the documents that are sought by this committee. Then, 8 days later, the House here votes to hold Eric Holder in criminal contempt. The next month, a congressional report is released placing blame on the acting ATF Director Melson and Deputy Director Hoover. Hoover resigns that day. Then you, Mr. Horowitz, release a report a few months later that says, in essence, that there were 14 ATF individuals and DOJ employees who were responsible for management failures. I think that was a very polite way of putting it. And then it takes 2 years before finally DOJ turns over the 65,000 pages that have been sought. Why did it take so long to get those 65,000 pages?
I wouldn't know the answer on that, Congressman. We were not involved in the litigation.
You were not involved
or any
in
of that.
Do you know if any action was ever taken against those who are involved in the Fast and Furious scandal?
The acting director.
Okay.
Yes, Congressman. That would be me as the deciding official on Fast and Furious. Many of the people retired, but I know that I believe it was July of last year, a document was provided to this committee regarding each person listed and their status and any discipline they received, and to respect the privacy laws. That's how it was delivered. And it is DOJ policy that I not speak publicly on those.
So there was some action taken against some, is that?
There was action and things were resolved.
Okay. Could you provide this committee with what was taken? Because it appears as though there was some criminal activity involved. Well, let me ask you, Mr. Horowitz, would you agree with that? I mean, in your findings, you used the phrase management failures, but I mean, Congress is holding Eric Holder in criminal contempt. I mean, is there criminal activity involved in this whole Fast and Furious?
We didn't see criminal activity by the agents or the prosecutors involved in the case. We did find, as you noted, very serious failures in what occurred and how they handled themselves and their responsibilities.
Okay, with Eric Holder.
Again, Congressman, on the documents back and forth, given our independence as an independent entity within the department, we were not in the middle of any of the back and forth, and so I only know what I've read in the newspaper about that.
Okay. Do you have any idea, either of you, how much of the 65,000 pages that were finally turned over were redacted, percentage-wise?
Sir, I don't.
Okay. Mr. Brandon, I mean, as a result of Fast and Furious, you've testified that there's lessons learned, things have changed. Now, does ATF, do you believe, have a responsibility to disrupt potential straw purchasing, even if they're unable to obtain a prosecution?
Yes, sir. As I commented, that was one of the things when I came up here, saying that agents don't get credit for interdiction and deterrence. And I'll give you an example. My life was impacted. I was in Detroit. I got sent to Phoenix over Fast and Furious. And when I was sitting down with people looking at information coming in on multiple sales, it would be, hey, we don't have the time to build a criminal case. And I said, hey, you can knock on the door and do an old shoe leather, and that would be interdiction or deterrence, and emphasizing that. So to answer your question, we now give credit for ATF agents who do exactly that investigative work where previously they didn't get credit in all the spirit of public safety to prevent guns, like I mentioned, to be on the left side of boom, to prevent it from happening.
Okay, thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. We were talking just now about Fast and Furious, and several members on this committee are, of course, very familiar with the ATF problems in previous years through the investigation that occurred on this committee. Mr. Horowitz, your office issued recommendations from Fast and Furious review in 2012. That's correct, right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Brandon, you say that there are key lessons that ATF has learned from in the aftermath of Fast and Furious and how the agency has changed, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you say those are substantial?
Yes, and cultural within the organization.
Now, was that based on just the IG's report or this committee as well?
Well, I think a combination of both, and to answer your question, ma'am.
Thank you. And, you know, this committee, of course, relies on you, Mr. Horowitz, tremendously. I think maybe you should have a seat up here as well. You come and testify in front of us so often. Well, maybe not up here, but, you know, you can have a staff seat because we rely on you so tremendously for the work that you do that then leads to other investigations, leads to hearings that we have as in Fast and Furious. Last week, Mr. Horowitz, a number of Senate Judiciary members wrote to your office requesting an investigation of Attorney General Jeff Sessions in his recusal decision, his contacts with Russian officials, and his testimony to the Senate about those contacts. Did you receive that letter from those senators?
We did.
Okay, and can you tell us whether you plan on conducting that investigation?
One of the things we do when we get requests like that, and we've gotten a request from Senator Schumer as well, the chair of this committee, chair of House Judiciary, related to certain issues, there is we take them under advisement, carefully assess what the ask is, and then make a determination. So at this point, I don't have an answer for you on what, if anything, we might do in response, but we obviously take requests like that seriously, and we'll look at it.
So you've looked at it, you're looking at it, you're taking it under advisement, and at some point, would you let us know if you were going to make an investigation, or would you just conduct the investigation without our help?
We always respond to the member to let them know what we are intending to do.
Thank you. And we really appreciate that because it is the independence and the transparency of the IG's office that makes your work so important to us. And it's important that we believe that everyone understands the Department of Justice's own rules and regulations on recusals. The Code of Federal Regulations state, and I'm quoting here, no employee shall participate in a criminal investigation or prosecute if he has a personal or political relationship with any person or organization which he knows has a specific and substantial interest that would be directly affected by the outcome of the investigation or prosecution. The regulations go on to state a political relationship means a close identification with an elected official or candidate arising from service as a principal advisor thereto or a principal official thereof. We all know that Attorney General Sessions was the first senator to endorse Donald Trump in his presidential bid. He served as a key surrogate throughout the campaign, including since March of 2016, his official role as chairman of President Trump's National Security Advisory Committee. Mr. Horowitz, would you agree that Attorney General Sessions' role on the campaign meets the regulations criteria for recusal?
I'm going to defer on that, Congresswoman, if I could, because that's obviously something we would be thinking about in connection with the claims, allegations made in the letter.
And would you say that as well to my question of whether you agree or not that the Attorney General has a political relationship with President Trump and his campaign for president?
Again, I would defer on that for now, Congresswoman.
And do you agree, or would you defer to answer that President Trump has a specific or substantial interest that would be directly affected by the outcome of any investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election?
I would defer as well, Congresswoman.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Horace, from our reading, his final announcement, the Attorney General's announcement that he would recuse himself, would then have us conclude that he's recusing himself because of his role in the Trump campaign. Would you agree or not agree with that?
Again, I would defer given our review of the allegations that we've been getting.
And then, okay, so, but I mean, just following the logical conclusion of that, shouldn't other officials working at the Justice Department who work for the Trump campaign also recuse themselves from investigations related to the Trump campaign and to Russian interference?
I would want to know if there are such officials in the Justice Department and whether they have or have not recused before answering.
Would your investigation, as presented by the senators requesting that you investigate this, would it also entail you looking to see if there were other officials, or would it merely be within the scope of Attorney General Sessions?
I think it's fair to say that with any reviews we do, once we undertake a review, if we found other issues to look at that were closely related, we would pick up those issues as well.
Okay, thank you so much for responding to my questions, and I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here. Mr. Horowitz, your continued dedication, and thank you, Mr. Brandon, for your service. I have a lot of respect for the field agents. However, there are some troubling questions that really have not been answered. June to August 2010, we had the Eagle Pass and La Pryor seizures. We know that these firearms are being trafficked. We have obliterated serial numbers, and notwithstanding what we heard in testimony here today from you, Mr. Brandon, about the uncertainty of whether or not something could be seized or we need more laws, it's pretty clear, as you should know, that serial numbers obliterated constitute a real problem, and we can go into what those codes are. With regard to 2010, an ATF agent is tipped off by an FFL, often demonized. FFLs often demonized as the problem for making straw purchases, when the reality is they are the ones linking some of this because of their alertness. And then a decision is made at that point to allow the straw purchase to try to continue when we've already had the Osarios linked and tied with the La Pryor and the Eagle Pass seizures, but yet we're going to continue on with that. So my question to you, Mr. Horowitz, in your investigation, what value could you determine that these agents or others would find by allowing dozens of illegally purchased firearms to continue to walk?
In this review, like in Fast and Furious, I think that's one of the significant concerns we have. This was a different scenario than Fast and Furious, as we outlined, but when you see firearm violations and you have the opportunity to make arrests or take other investigative activity, given the risks associated with them, it's important to do that. The firearms you mentioned at those two seizures had 2 days to 2 weeks of time to crime stats. So,
which is a real problem. And so, okay, you can kind of look at, well, within the next month, they did make a purchase with an agent, but now we have 40 more firearms with obliterated serial numbers. Mr. Brandon, why did that not result in an instant arrest? We're talking literally scores of firearms now illegally trafficked. ATF's fully aware of it, and yet nothing happens in November 2010. Why was that?
The explanation from the Dallas Field Division, which Bill Temple wasn't in charge.
Yeah, we would have liked to have heard from him.
But so he used to work for me in Detroit, and he just got to Dallas, I believe, less than a year ago. But I'm not here to defend that, other than that there was a...
Why was no arrest made? Why? I mean, we were talking scores of firearms. We know they're going south. Why was no arrest made in November 2010?
There was a sensitive DEA investigation going on.
Okay. Well, then let's move on from that, because here's another problem that we have. We have The Osario is tied to this, and yet there's some uncertainty on the part of the ATF agents when, by the time they get to February of 2011, they're not sure if they go and they find in the Osario's bedroom these firearms, whether or not they're allowed to seize them. Well, my goodness, as the only firearms manufacturer in Congress, gee, even I know that if you've got illegal firearms in somebody's bedroom and you had a good warrant to go in and check it out and you got obliterated serial numbers, you're in deep kimchi. So what happened?
Well, sir, I agree with the OIG. The group supervisor for the firearms trafficking group, he failed to communicate that to the agents who were in there. It's again, I'm not defending it and how we've
And this is the frustration that we have, Mr. Brandon, because what's happened is that, we had dedicated agents like yourself lost their life because people were not doing their job. And worse, we had a desire on the part, which we've been trying to get to the bottom of people to allow these firearms to walk south for reasons yet to be determined. And yet everyone wants to sweep that under the rug. And with regard to my colleagues that have stated about the law and the need for more laws, I would remind everyone the 1968 Gun Control Act requires serial numbers and has. 18th U.S. Code Section 922K, 26 U.S. Code 5861, paragraph G, lays out requirements for what constitutes legal firearms. And it's illegal to possess firearms that have serial numbers removed, obliterated, or altered. Mr. Brandon, are you familiar with Don't Lie for the Other Guy program?
Yes, with the National Shooting Sports Foundation.
Sure, and not only them, but my goodness, for 17 years now we've had that program. Is it or is it not a felony to make a straw purchase? And here we're talking about the need from your own mouth in acknowledgement to some of my colleagues' queries that we need to have a law to prevent this type of trafficking or straw purchases. Are you not aware of the Don't Lie for the Other Guy program?
I'm aware of it.
Do you know what the penalties are for that?
Yeah, there's a 5-year felony and a 10-year felony.
No, it's 10 years, sir. 10-year felony for federal crime and up to $250,000 fine. You can find that in U.S. Code 18, Section 924C and E. Be happy to show it to you. Here's the problem. We are talking around this issue. I have every belief that you are dedicated to your job, but right now we have 3 empty chairs, and we have you that doesn't even seem to know what the U.S. Code are. Now, I like to believe that I like to believe that you do know those, but Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we have a regroup. The ranking member has not been allowed to have his witness here today. We've had others. We've not even gotten to get to the tobacco issues. We need to have some follow-on here. And Mr. Horowitz, I'm very grateful for the things that you've dug up. You've exposed some things. We're grateful for that. Mr. Brandon, I do believe you're dedicated. But I tell you what, it ain't looking too pretty here today. I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Could I get a minute?
Mr. Brandon, you're recognized, sir.
Mr. Russell.
I'm out of time, that's why.
I'm aware there's 2 statutes. One's a 5-year, one's a 10-year, so I didn't want you to come away with that. But I would also like to comment what you said about federal firearms licensees. We've built, and that's one of the things under my charge, a better relationship and communication with the federal firearms licensee, because they are the front line of defense in receiving that information. And if you even go onto ATF's webpage yesterday, Twitter, one of the things under my leadership was the number of FFL burglaries that have been happening across the country and FFL robberies, things that weren't tracked till 5 years ago. So I just wanted to share that I have a passion for recognizing we regulated an industry and good, honest, hardworking men and women dealing in a lawful commodity, and that are absolutely vital to our intelligence-led, risk-based way of giving business. And they should have followed up. When that FFL called and gave those names, that should have been an alarm going off. So I just thank you for letting me make that comment.
Thank you, of course. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to echo the gentleman from Oklahoma's request for follow-up on this, because I think we really do need to drill down on this. Mr. Brandon, last month the New York Times wrote a story raising some troubling questions about ATF's use of confidential informants in a tobacco operation that I guess was underway from 2011 to 2013. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this story by Matt Apuzzo, New York Times, February 22nd. The title is, "An ATF filled secret bank account with millions from shadowy cigarette sales."
Without objection, so ordered.
So the article reported that the ATF officials directed confidential informants to engage in sham transactions with the collective of tobacco farmers and then used the off-the-books proceeds in an undercover ATF investigation. This is called churning. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the way it works is you use those illicit funds to fund your own operation. Is that right?
For continuing the operations.
Okay. While ATF did, in this case, possess a special authority granted to it under the Bush administration that allows the use of black market cash and proceeds in undercover operations called churning, the news report further alleged that this operation exceeded that authority. Do you believe that they exceeded the authority in this case?
Congressman, like I testified previously and included in my opening statement, that the United States government is a party to civil litigation, and I cannot comment that. Also, the judge has it under seal.
Okay. How long is that seal going to be in place? Do you have any idea?
I believe it's till the 24th of this month.
Good, good. We can have you back. Do gentlemen wish me to yield?
Yeah, and we'll give you plenty of extra time to make up for this. You commented, quote, that we're allowed to do, end quote, as it relates to that. What have you done to address the court and ask permission to comply with a congressional request for that material? Have you called the judge? Have you petitioned the court? We go through this regularly. Mm-hmm. We're guided by the Constitution. We don't have these prohibitions. That information should be given to us. But we need you to approach the court and tell them the dilemma that you're in order to release that information.
Mr. Chairman, we've had conversations with the DOJ, the U.S. attorneys who are over this civil litigation, and I'm punting to them for that answer.
Okay. And we're snapping the ball to you, saying the ball's in your hands, okay, and saying you need to approach the court and make the request to give them permission to comply with a congressional directive.
Okay, I'll take that back.
Sorry, go back to Mr.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time. Mr. Horowitz, are you familiar with this particular use of confidential informants for this cigarette scam, which apparently generated millions of dollars and were put in these accounts?
I'm certainly familiar with these churning accounts from our 2013 audit and the work we did there and the substantial problems we found through that audit.
Okay. How did we vet these particular informants? I mean, under the Reno guidelines, mm-hmm, there's certain conduct that would disqualify someone from being a confidential, mm-hmm, informant on behalf of the ATF. Were these folks vetted, or were they in compliance with the Reno standards?
I'm not sure I know, as I sit here today, the specific individuals in the case under seal, but I will say more broadly, we found in our audit that in 33 of the 35 instances that we looked at back in 2013, that the critical information required by ATF policy to start the operation wasn't present, and we found a major churning investigation that hadn't ever been approved and that the committee that was supposed to meet to review it never met. And we are close to issuing a report on ATF's handling of its confidential informants more broadly beyond this matter, and can certainly discuss with you when we get that report out in the next, hopefully, month or so, those issues further.
Mr. Brannon, I know your previous answer was limited because of the seal. Is there anything you wish to dispute that has been put out here in terms of the allegations are very, very serious?
Yes, sir, they are. The one thing I would like to assert is what the OIG is, their thorough investigation of our churning cases, as you said, where we recognized there was a problem, and 7 years ago, in candor to you and the committee, the policy was lacking, the oversight was lacking, the leadership was poor, and we shut those down. There hasn't been a churning case since 2013, but I compliment the OIG and his team because they did an excellent report. We cooperated fully, and there are no longer any outstanding recommendations regarding churning from the OIG with ATF.
Okay. Is that authorization still out there, though? I know it came from the Bush administration. Has anybody pulled that back, or is it just your own decision not to operate that way?
We put in tight policy, and to answer your question, it's still out there. However, there have been no requests for churning investigations because it's a very tight policy and standard to open a churning investigation, and we have not done so since.
Okay. Mr. Horowitz, from the accounting, in terms of these accounts with the cash coming in and then going back out, it's sort of self-contained, and you know there's the opportunity for abuse. Let's put it that way. Any recommendations that you have with regard to the way this is handled?
Well, we've certainly made several in connection with that review, and it's a report that we made sure the department saw and made recommendations to the Deputy AG's office because of the broader concern of whether any other federal law enforcement agencies might have churning accounts and how they're doing things. But clearly, there needs to be far stricter controls than were in place back then. ATF has made changes in response, and that's what led us to close the recommendations as to ATF.
Well, that's good news, but was anybody disciplined for what they've described going on here in the New York Times article?
I'm limited in what I can say other than, as we indicated in the audit, our auditors referred matters for further investigation to our agents, and I need to leave it at that.
Okay. I know the chairman has a document request, and I believe it's due tomorrow. Mr. Brannon, are we prepared? Are you prepared to deliver those documents?
Like I've testified, Congressman, I've pulled people from the field. They've been working through the weekend, and we are diligently working to comply with the request.
Okay, I think I've exhausted my time. I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure, I would. Sure.
I believe there's a great big asterisk, though, to the end of that sentence, right? You're not going to provide us the things that you believe are under seal by the court, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to comply with the U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ dealing with those legal matters.
Okay.
Just sort of as a follow-up, yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think if we get to the 24th and that seal goes away or there's greater cooperation on the part of the court, maybe we reconvene this hearing with all the folks that are missing and go at this again.
Oh, we'll no doubt have people back, but it has been the long-term practice prior to me that this should not be, civil litigation is not a prohibition on Congress being able to do its job, get its documents that it receives. And I agree. So, yeah, we plan to issue a subpoena. The moment you provide that document production and it's shy of what we asked for, we'll send you a subpoena. And so we're planning on sending that to you on the 13th. I'd rather not. I'd rather have you give us all the documents we request, but we don't recognize that civil litigation given our constitutional duties. Anyway.
Just one question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to go back for a moment, Mr. Horowitz. Maybe you can answer this. This seal is a court seal, right? Who's sealing him? I assume it's the court.
As I sit here, that's my understanding, but I haven't been involved in the litigation.
And if the court seals it, the court has to unseal it, right?
Correct.
I mean, civil or criminal, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Okay.
And in fact, as the committee knows, we're dealing with that on the report that we issued on the Osorio-Barba matter, which is certain matters were under seal, and we're asking the department to go back to the court and get it unsealed so we can redact it.
All right. Okay. All right.
It's our belief that a congressional seal bars them from making it public, but to provide it to to the United States Congress is not one of those prohibitions of a seal. A court seal, I should say, not a congressional seal, but a court seal prohibits them somebody from making it public. Providing the information we have requested to the United States Congress is not making it public. Therefore, we don't recognize that seal as something that prohibits Congress from doing its job. And that's our position. And Mr. Brandt, I know that puts you in a tough spot, but carry that message back, if you will.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, we've now recognized Mr. Guthman from the state of Wisconsin is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, Mr. Arts, thanks for being here. You've seen a lot of interesting things you brought forth today. Can you give me other examples, or are you aware of any other examples in the last 5 years in which ATF, by not communicating with DOA, has led to, you'd say, errors in investigations?
As I sit here, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I do think we found in the storefronts report that we did, and I have to just go back and refresh myself, concerns about its coordination in some of those storefronts that were several years back with state and federal prosecutors and the coordination between them on who would take which cases and whether they would in fact take cases.
Okay, we'll flip to Mr. Brandon. What are you doing to make sure that your agents coordinate with the U.S. attorneys as quickly as possible compared to the past?
Congressman, as I testified, we established what we call Frontline, an intelligence-led, risk-based business model in the beginning of 2012. And in that, every special agent in charge of a division has to do an annual domain assessment. And that came from me that they had to share that with the U.S. attorney and his first assistant, the criminal chief, to make sure that ATF is in step with the U.S. attorney. And it also makes us more efficient and effective on our resources to make sure that what we're investigating are the most violent people and that there'll be a prosecution from it.
Do you feel the U.S. attorney's willingness to prosecute a straw purchasing case is influenced by how you investigate a case?
Sure. You know, I mean, prosecutors want good cases. I don't blame them, and that's our job to deliver them. But I also know that across the country, U.S. attorneys have different challenges on what they're wanting to investigate with their resources, so it's not the same all across the board.
Do you ever change your investigative methods because you think the case is unlikely to lead to prosecution?
To Canada, there have been some divisions where if it didn't look like the U.S. attorney would take it, that we'd go to the state attorney general's office for a prosecution.
And do you feel you have the responsibility to disrupt straw purchasing or firearms trafficking, even if you think you're unable to obtain a prosecution or conviction?
Yes, sir. And as I testified, I really believe the interdiction and deterrence credit that we give agents for their production has helped knock down a number of say, straw purchases where they get scared off and let them know that they've come under ATF attention. So I keep using the expression, but it'd be on the left side of boom. That wasn't in the culture. It was, why waste our time on this if we're not going to get a prosecution? And sometimes we put an emphasis on public safety with interdiction and deterrence from firearms getting in the wrong hands.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. I want to go back to something that Mr. Lynch was talking about. Mr. Horowitz, to get to a churning situation, I guess that really calls for some folks to be cooperating, right? I mean, in other words, you got to have several people working together for that to happen, right?
That's my understanding from what we've seen.
And so, you know, when I read the story, and I know we can't get into that too much here, I was kind of surprised to even see that particularly after all the Fast and Furious stuff that we've been through, it just seemed to be a bit much. I was shocked, to be frank with you. Mm-hmm. Were you?
I have to say I was not, primarily because
you had more information.
Because our 2013 audit identified many similar situations, frankly, of a lack of controls. In that circumstance, we not only found a problem with the controls over the bank accounts, and the controls over the CIs, the informants, but the controls over the cigarettes themselves. The ATF couldn't reconcile all the cigarettes with a substantial value to them. So in that report, we saw a series of failures, so frankly, I wasn't particularly surprised.
So is this people, you think this is just people in the agency that just say, you know, we will use any method necessary to get the job done, or are there people that just say we don't care about, you know, how this is going to appear? In other words, I'm concerned that if we, you can let any agency or any organization get lulled into a culture of I do it the way I want to do it. And that's why I was asking about, does it take several people? How do we even get there?
Yeah. This was...
Because I don't want to see it happening again. We shouldn't be opening up the New York Times, reading about this kind of stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the churning issues that we identified, the issues in Fast and Furious we identified, the ATF storefronts report, some of the things we've been before the committee and talked about on DEA's side, those were not, generally speaking, as you just indicated, Congressman, one person running amok. They were multiple people without adequate controls, leadership, and oversight, being able to do what they thought, in most of those instances, not all, were advancing law enforcement interests, when in fact they weren't.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Desagnier of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And along the lines of what the ranking member just mentioned, we've heard in this committee and when you've come and testified before, Mr. Horowitz, just on lessons learned and doing reasoned, nonpartisan interventions. So to Mr. Brendan, does ATF maintain a database of federal law enforcement weapons that have been lost or stolen?
No, we don't.
Right. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from, there's been a lot of media attention. The San Jose Mercury News has done an extensive series of stories, you may have read it, about lost and stolen weapons by both state, local, and federal officers. 2 people have lost their lives that I'm aware of because of lost and stolen federal weapons. One by an agent from the Bureau of Land Management that led to the tragic death of Kate Steinle, a former constituent of mine. That's led to a larger discussion both by the President and members of Congress about immigration status. But the fact remains that that gun that was used in that murder and another murder in Oakland were federal law enforcement officers who had weapons stolen. So I have a bill, and to my friend from Oklahoma, I don't need to have a bill passed. I've also asked the administration, the previous administration, could you at least, led by ATF, create a policy that was germane to all federal law enforcement, both on proper storage of weapons, so we wouldn't have the situation that happened in San Francisco, that happens a lot in San Francisco, unfortunately, where if there's anything in the car, thieves will break a window and grab and snatch and grab anything in there. That led to these 2 deaths. So it just seems to me common sense that you would lead an effort to make sure that there was the best policy possible, whether it requires statute or not, to make sure that we have learned the lesson in this instance and others, just in terms of an inventory control and accountability issue, that you'd make sure that these kind of things were at least minimized. And the fact that you don't even create a database to follow these things for federal law enforcement seems to me to be negligence in the extreme. And personally, having seen constituents, people suffer the consequences. So my question is, the state of California responded to this by passing the statute that required federal and state agencies, because they have been guilty of the same thing. And sometimes, quite tragically, I will add to the law enforcement officers, I have another constituent who was a police chief, and his weapons were stolen out of his car in a driveway in a very affluent community and used to commit a crime. And he was horrified and quite guilty about it. So I've heard sort of the culture question by the ranking member, friends of mine in law enforcement saying, you shouldn't be imposing these, we care about public safety, let us take care of it. But that's not enough. I really think that it's incumbent on you, and the IG has pointed this out, to develop better inventory control and better accountability and better consequences for federal law enforcement officers and better preventative practices. So my question is, as I understand the law in California, federal agents will have to comply with that. And if you're aware of how you are helping to comply with that effort and why we don't do it on a national level, and I don't think it needs statute. I think you could do it administratively, and it would help a great deal. So could you respond to that, those observations?
Yes, Congressman, and you described tragedies, and I remember reading about it in the paper. As far as ATF, and I know the other agencies as well, that we account for our firearms inventory, and that's an annual thing, that as far as having to account for every firearm, I will share my sensitivity to what you were saying is that when I was in the deputy director position, I increased the penalty if an agent had a firearm stolen out of their car to a mandatory 5 days off without compensation, and it couldn't be reduced. And I was sending a message culturally because of the sensitivity of, which has become prominent amongst people stealing guns out of cars. I've gone to St. Petersburg. The chief had billboards up about please lock your car up, secure your firearm. I was in Memphis. The chief was saying the same thing. So I support that. Whether or not ATF would be the custodian of everybody's firearms, I believe that it's being done at each law enforcement bureau or component, and that we do an annual inventory, and that any firearm that is stolen at ATF, that it is investigated by our internal affairs. The OIG always has a chance of reviewing the files, and then it will go through for our process for discipline.
Mr. Brandon, I hope that all of those changes actually result in a positive thing that we both want, but it's not working so far. We just had another incident with an FBI agent out of the Concord, California bureau office, which is in my hometown, where multiple weapons were taken. So it's not working. So my question is why, given that law enforcement has said over and over again, we care about these things, we're doing things as you have pointed out to, but it's not working. So understood that there's going to be some margin of error and there are going to be instances, but we aren't doing enough. So my admonition request for you and to the committee is we need to do things and do it across the board to all federal agencies, as the state of California is doing for state and local officers, and make sure, particularly on the front end, on storage of the weapons, and when they're not in use, if they're not on your person, the new law says they've got to be locked in your trunk and have a gun lock on them, which seems to me to be the right thing to do. So I would just ask you and the committee that we continue to pursue this in the prevention area in this larger thing, but so we don't have these tragic situations, knowing that they may happen on occasion, but they're happening far too often as it is right now.
No, thank you, Congressman. And ATF's policy is what you said it is about secure storage of firearms in a vehicle. It has to be not just in a trunk, but within a container that's within that trunk that is designed for firearms storage.
So my only observation is that's great, but it's not working across all federal agencies in the degree that you have ability to enforce that and bring up the best standards I think we should be pursuing.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Congressman, we have a quarterly meeting at DOJ with FBI, DEA, Marshals, and FBI, the four components. I'll bring it up at the meeting as a topic of the firearm storage.
I would appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a good point. The committee's happy to follow up. Perhaps we could get an inventory or some sort of indication as to what they're doing or not doing in that. So let us work with you on that as well. It's a good point. I'll now recognize myself. Mr. Horowitz, you said earlier that your office found no criminal conduct from anyone involved in Fast and Furious. I want to ask about former ATF Phoenix Field Division Assistant Special Agent in Charge George Dillette, who was heavily involved in running Fast and Furious. He had personally purchased a firearm. What happened, do you recall, to that firearm?
I do, and it was transferred by him to a non-U.S. national.
And so he sold it to a non-U.S. national, and what happened with that gun? Where did they find it?
I believe, if I recall correctly, it was a scene of a crime, but I'd have to go back and just make sure I remember.
Yeah, I think that's the way we recall it as well. Mr. Brandon, when you fill out Form 4473, are you allowed to use your work address, or are you supposed to use your home address?
You're supposed to use the residence you live at.
If they put something other than your home address, can you prosecute those crimes? Is that a crime?
If you intentionally, knowingly put something down false on a form, yes, it is.
So the form says you're supposed to put your home address, correct?
I believe so, as I recall, yes.
Yeah. So something other than your home address would be inaccurate, correct?
Correct. I mean, I bought a gun last summer. I put down my apartment.
So Did the Inspector General's office make any recommendation to the Department of Justice to consider prosecuting him for, this is Mr. Gillette, for lying about his address on Form 4473? Mr. Horowitz?
I don't believe we did.
And why not?
Because what we've been told, or we're told, is that for law enforcement agents at the department, many of them use do not use their home address for security purposes, but instead use a P.O. box or UPS box or some other location, and that wasn't sufficient evidence of intent to warrant a criminal prosecution.
Even though he sold it to a non-U.S. national and it ended up at a crime, and he used an address that's different on the form, you just decided that, yeah, we won't prosecute that. And what's hard for the American people to understand is why that waiver. Are these forms publicly available? I mean, can you just go look this up?
I believe you can. I think if you go on the internet and look, it's on ATF's website.
But I mean, can you look up, oh, let's go find an ATF agent, and then we look at his form, see if he purchased anything, and oh, there's his address? I mean, what are we trying to protect from?
I defer to
Mr. Brandon. Is that common practice? Is that what ATF agents are doing, is putting work address on there?
You know, not to my knowledge. I was surprised at George Gillette's response, and candid to you, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad he's off ATF. He wasn't one of our best. And people that were doing undercover work, ATF would provide undercover identification, and that would be the permissible type.
Right.
But I think, if I remember correctly, he was using a drop box at a mail place, a P.O. box, and I was surprised. And it's not common that I know of to ATF.
This, let me switch gears. Mr. Brandon, you said that there was a person that was supposed to, who had a group supervisor who was supposed to have some responsibility here. We're going back to the Zapata case. I think the phrase you used, asleep at the switch.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take for you to all figure out, and I'm not talking about you personally, but the organization, how long did it take ATF to figure out that there was somebody asleep at the switch? And the second part of that is, what happened to him? Was he fired? Was he disciplined? Did you give him bonuses? What happened to this person?
The person retired from ATF.
As a result of this, right after it? I mean, help me with the time span. 6 years have passed, so help me with the time span.
Well, I know the employee from reading the report that the OIG interviewed him. He retired before the report came out, and his reputation wasn't that of a dynamic leader that was engaged.
Mr. Horowitz, can you weigh in on this?
My understanding is he retired in June of 2012, so even before we got the referral in September 2012.
Okay.
And before we began our review.
Have you, Mr. Horowitz, have you had, we've talked in general about access issues to a whole host of things. Are you having access issues at the ATF?
We are not, and I want to be clear also, the delay had nothing to do with any access issues with ATF. We got what we needed. That was not a reason.
Outside the Zapata case, on a broader sense, are there access issues that you care to highlight here at this hearing?
Currently, we do not. The ATF has been very good in the last several years about getting us, even as we were having fights with DEA and FBI, our access issues with ATF were actually within connection with the Fast and Furious matter.
Well, let's note that 12/11, we got some good news. So congratulations, Mr. Brandon. We thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Let's move on. My time's expired.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I didn't want to think anybody that I was lying. I confused that there was another employee that retired at the end of 16 that the OIG was critical of in documenting his surveillance and interview of an FFL. So that's what I was referring to my head, just for the clarification. I didn't want to be inconsistent.
No, thank you. Let's go back to Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, I want to go back to the cigarette smuggling case. Mr. Brannon, you had ATF agents working with at least a couple of informants in that case. And it says here in the New York Times article that they were funneling tens of millions of dollars, and then apparently they're using the black market cash to pay the informants. Is that a usual practice?
Again, sir, if I can comment, not particularly to this investigation that's under seal, but in churning in general, and how the OIG's report was spot on, and that oversight was deficient, policy was deficient. It was a hot mess, and that's why we shut it down in all of them. In 2013, there hasn't been another one, and I actually, welcome when everything that can come out on this case that the government's a party of.
All right, let me thank you for that, Mr. Horowitz. So I'm trying to follow your investigation. You did a very good report. I think it was a 2013 report. You went back from, I think, February of 2006 to about June of 2011, right?
Yes.
So we got that block of time. Right. You had some reports there where informants were being paid, some of them $1 million, $1 million a year to pay an informant. Who I think at that point was working with the DEA, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so now we have another report from the New York Times that goes to January and February of 2011. So it's within the scope of your study, Mr. Horowitz, your report. So there's some overlap here, that this churning is going on. So is your investigation, did you cover this? Did you cover the accounts? I'm trying to figure out how much, is the money being reported properly? Who did it go to? How much money were these folks getting?
Again, I don't know all the specifics of the matter and what's under seal.
But did you investigate that, though?
But I will say that given what my auditors looked at and the accounts they looked at, I believe we looked at the breadth of the undercover churning accounts that ATF was using, and that our audit report covered those accounts in full, and that the problems we identified covered that. Now, when we finished in June 2011 in our field work, one of the reasons it took some time to issue the report was frankly because as we were doing our audit work beginning in early 2011, ATF was making many of the changes that that Acting Director Brandon outlined, and so what we ended up doing was continually updating our audit report, which caused us to want to make sure we were picking up some of the changes they made, and they asked us to look at some of the changes they made. So I think...
I was just trying to get the timeline down to make sure that you were looking at this case, and it appears that you did, part of your investigation at least, captured this before the practices ended.
I will say this, I don't, again, know all the specifics of what's under seal, but if it fell into a period through June 2011, I think it's safe to say that our auditors looked at the scope of their churning accounts through June 2011, and my guess is the acting director, given our back and forth, could probably speak to that as well, as to whether we looked at all of their churning accounts.
All right. Well, you know what we'll do is we'll wait till the 24th and have another bite at that, just to make sure we're right. All right. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
It would be legislative malpractice, Mr. Brannon, if I didn't ask you these questions. In my district, in the inner city of Baltimore, you got situations where young men can get a gun just as fast as they can get a cigarette. And it's interesting that there has been a proliferation of sales of guns. And I'm just wondering, how does that make your job harder? And how do you all deal with that? And you don't have to sugarcoat it with me. I believe that the ATF has been treated like a stepchild. And I think there are some that, if they had their way, would get rid of you guys immediately. One of the reasons why Mr. Lynch's questions are so significant, and one of the reasons why Fast and Furious was so significant, is because it then gives people who don't like you and your organization justification to treat your organization the way it is treated. And anybody who knows anything about the ATF can sit here and be dishonest, but I believe that with all my heart, because I attend the funerals of young, particularly black men, who died tragic deaths. And even my own nephew, brains blown away on a wall, being robbed. That was in Norfolk 5 years ago. They still haven't found the person who did it. But I know the ATF got involved. But this is my question. Yesterday, I had a meeting with President Trump. You know, and I told him, I said, Mr. President, do me a favor. When you talk about the black community, don't just make it sound as if we're all in some bunkers somewhere suffering. Don't judge us by a weakest link. But he keeps saying something that I'm trying to figure out. He keeps saying that he's going to send in the feds. I don't know who he's talking about. I guess troops. I don't know. Probably ATF to help with places like Baltimore. And he loves to talk about Baltimore. He loves to talk about Chicago. And we know we have limited resources. One of our members told you a little bit earlier that you just got to do more with less, pretty much. So if the president came to you and said, Brandon, you know, how can we use our resources best to help places like Baltimore and Chicago, what would you say? Because I'm just wondering how he would do that. I know about the task force, you know, people working, because we've got that in Baltimore. That to me is important. But just send people in and say, ATF, you know, look at the situation, do whatever you want. I mean, what would your recommendation be? Because he's probably going to come to you if he hasn't already, or somebody's going to come to you.
Congressman, I appreciate the question. And
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No.
I'm really curious because I want us to be effective and efficient in whatever we do, and I know you do too.
No, I would love the opportunity, and this is, like I said, I think everybody wants to be tight with the taxpayers' money, and I'm one of those persons. But one of the things from the major city chiefs that they all said is what we would do is go in with enhanced enforcement initiatives for 90 to 20 days, and you're not selling sustainability. There's a program called the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, called NIBIN. It's been a game changer, and it's where the casings at shootings, and perhaps I don't know if this was done with your nephew in Norfolk, but that is then entered in to what they call it's a fancy microscope that puts a digital signature on the casing, much like a fingerprint. And when you have a comprehensive with the PDs and it goes through NIBIN, it will link up shootings in different states and to go after people. And I'll give you an example if I had the chance to talk to President Trump. This is not me asking to be, you know, we've done more with less, but this is good for the American public. It's decimal dust, $50 million to $100 million for this technology, not for another ATF employee. It's the example was when I was at San Diego, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The deputy chief made a point, and I was speaking before the Police Executive Research Forum. He said, our PD got shot at. within 12 hours, we collected that, had that scanned in, and it went down to our National NIBIN Correlation and Training Center, where we as ATF said, how can we serve the state and locals better? Within 12 hours, we sent the response back saying that shooting at that PD is matched up to 3 other shootings. It went to our Crime Gun Intelligence Center, which is, you know, the misery of Fast and Furious, and I don't defend it, was us establishing Crime Gun Intelligence Center, where you collect, analyze, and synthesize and disseminate information rapidly with our law enforcement partners. They had 3 or 4 guys locked up within 24 hours. So if I had the president's ear, that's what I would say. NIBIN is, it's a game changer for investigative lead on what I refer to as trigger pullers, and then to go after the traffickers that are supplying them with firearms. And I think it's something everybody can wrap their arms around because, as you well know, sir, and I spent a lot of my career in Detroit, and the victims, it's painful to watch people being shot. And the misery it does on the families. And then there's shootings even at funerals, as you know, I've done surveillances on those and so forth. So to answer your question, I believe even if I was a taxpayer outside of ATF, this is something worthy of attention to address the gun violence across America. And also, to reiterate the point, I think we've made a lot of progress in working with our local PDs on FFL, federal firearms license lead burglaries. Last year, there were over 7,500 guns stolen during FFL burglaries. And so we're trying to say, hey, prevent that, working with the National Shooting Sports Foundation and others at the SHOT Show and so forth to educate them for security. And again, it's different than an armed robbery where we could hit them federally with 924C, you know, or the Hobbs Act and so forth like that. A FFL burglary is a different animal. But that's what I would say, and it's not, it's just the right thing.
Thank you very much.
I recognize myself. These machines, they cost how much?
Mr. Chairman, I have to go back, but I think it may be $129,000. And if I may comment, where, again, to your point of the cost of this, which is just like fire departments have done across the country and tactical teams doing regionalization, that not every PD needs a machine, you know, and you can have where they have memorandums of agreement and that I know of other PDs that say, hey, come down on Tuesdays, enter all your casings. So it's an expensive item, but it saves lives.
We just want to work with you. I'd love to learn more about it, and if you have, you can just educate us on that. We'd love to help you get more of them. So
yeah, no, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate it. I would love to.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. You said something that really caught my ear, and it's something the committee has been looking at, and we would really appreciate your help. I was encouraged when you said that the statistics that you have at your disposal, you said, quote, we don't want to waste our time on cases that won't be prosecuted. And that's true with every law enforcement agency I've ever encountered, right? There's nothing more frustrating than the men and women who go out there, do the hard work, they put a case together, and then a prosecutor says, it's not as sexy, it's not as jury friendly as we hoped it would be, and so, hey, you know, we're not gonna do anything here. In order for us to get our arms wrapped around that, you're as swift as you can, providing us sort of, and I think a 3-year window, unless somebody else wants to weigh in here. I don't want to go back 15 years, but if you can look back over the past 3 years and give us some statistics, here's how many straw purchasing cases we had. Here's how many, I've got to push the Department of Justice to find out what they're actually prosecuting, but my guess is most every one of your agents already knows if I give them this paperwork, they're not going to prosecute it, so why bother, right? So I want to know what those cases are, but as importantly, I want to know what you have given them. And in the example and the parallel I'm giving is at the TSA. TSA, I cannot say enough about their Instagram account. You want to go see an amazing Instagram account, go to the TSA one. every day they're putting up pictures of guns and other types of weapons and knives and things that people are trying to bring on airplanes. And then when you go work with the local law enforcement, when you work with the prosecutors, it's crickets. They almost never prosecute anybody. And my guess is we're having the exact same phenomenon throughout the country with these gun violations. I need exposure to that. And that's where your help in providing us those statistics sooner rather than later. I don't know what time frame to put on that, but you did say that they were fairly easy to put together. Can you get back to us as to when's a reasonable time and to provide us those statistics?
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to.
That would be really helpful. Please do familiarize yourself with that churning case as highlighted in the New York Times. We will be having a hearing about this. I need to know that you're personally involved and engaged on this and that you're willing to cooperate with us on this investigation. Do I have your cooperation on that?
Mr. Chairman, you absolutely do, and whatever I'm legally allowed to do without getting a jam with a federal judge, I'm all yours to testify.
I know I've said it a couple times, but you're providing Congress the information requested is not making that information public, and I would not. We not only do we not recognize the seal, so to speak, but we don't believe it binds you. But I know there are lots of attorneys that are going to give you a lot of advice. But we do need that information, and at the very least, we also need you to try to pursue that in the court if you think you have to. Again, we don't think you have to, but if you think you have to, I want to make sure you're at least asking them.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Let me say this to you, Mr. Brandon. You know, so often we have these hearings and things don't get tied up properly. And I just want you to, I'm going to tell you what I told the chairman a few minutes ago about you. I said, I believe this guy's a good guy. And that he may not have fully understood the invitation, because I do feel your sincerity. I really do. I've interviewed a lot of witnesses in my career as a lawyer, and I just want to thank you for, you know, your candor. I mean, but I got to tell you something about this guy. He can be kind of nice, but once he thinks you understand him, you think you saw some fury today, it gets worse. So all I'm saying is that you are now on notice that an invitation, we expect you to make sure that folk get here as best you can.
Yeah.
Okay?
Mr. Chairman, my former boss said the education of Tom Brandon continues, and this was an education today. Again, it meant no disrespect, was trying to do the right thing, but hey, obviously it didn't go that well, but I appreciate your comments about me being candid and open, and that's my MO.
And we also thank you for your service, because
I appreciate
obviously
that.
You've been through a lot. You've seen a lot.
Fast and Furious changed my life.
Yeah.
And I stayed in the game. I stayed in the fight because I love the men and women of ATF. They do a vital, important mission of protecting the public and serving our nation. And, you know, ATF of 2017 is not the ATF of 2010 when much of this stuff happened, and I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to say that.
Thank you very much.
No, and I want to thank you for your service and your candor. You're earning our respect, and the proof will be in the pudding as we move forward. But I do believe you too, and I think we better understand each other, and hopefully greater DOJ understands us as well. But I think we made the message clear, and I appreciate you working with us. And again, back to your service as in the United States Marines and moving forward, you've done a lot for this nation and put your life on the line on a regular basis, which is more than most people do, and we admire and I can't say enough about the men and women who also serve with you in doing that, because we're up here wearing ties and real critical, and yet you see what the 16-hour days these people put in with their lives on the line, dealing with the worst scum you can possibly imagine. And I want you to know we all recognize that, and grateful that people will step up and do that, not only at ATF, but other departments and agencies as well, everywhere, everybody from Border Patrol to working in the prisons to, I mean, it's tough. It's tough. And we don't say or praise people enough for the good work and the sacrifices they make and their families make, you know, their spouses, their kids, their friends, their family, their parents. It's tough, and they do amazing work, and we never compensate them enough. But I do hope from time to time we stop and pause and recognize them. So, again, I think it's one of the beauties of this nation is that we have these kind of really candid discussions, and but we've also got a duty to do on both sides of these tables here, and so we appreciate you working with us and helping us to ultimately get to the truth and make things better. And so, and to Mr. Horowitz, again, the number of people that work with you at the IG's office know how much we appreciate them. Thank all the members here today. It's an important topic and something we will continue to follow up on. The committee stands adjourned.